Growing tomatoes at home is easy. All you really need are tomato seeds and patience. Patience will come at a higher price. It's always nice to start seeds, the ritual of starting seeds in spring, around March, February even. I start tomato seeds early on because I want to make sure that I have bigger plants when I put them in the ground. That will make them produce faster and also produce better. Tomatoes, they're the type of vegetable or fruit, botanically speaking, that I do not buy during winter. I do not buy it from the stores because it's such a insipid fruit what you find in stores compared to the homegrown. Once you eat homegrown tomatoes, I don't think you'll ever want to buy or eat store-bought tomatoes. And the plate germination method, which is what I'm doing here, is the one I like to use, especially for tomatoes. It works really well because it forces them to germinate, and they germinate faster than if you just put them in soil directly. And the seeds are not too tiny, so it's sort of easy to handle. That's why it's worth it. It might be harder with things like lettuce or really tiny things like the seeds of petunias or poppy seeds. That would be impossible. But this works well, and that way I save the amount of seeds I use, because instead of having to sow like twice the amount of seeds in each cup, which is what people usually recommend to later on thin, I only use one. So if I buy one packet of tomatoes, it can last me 2 to 3 years. And tomato seeds usually are viable for that long, so it's not going to be a problem. Now, if you think that this is too much work and you don't like to do things that take some patience to do, like breaking out the seeds from the germinated seeds from the paper towel and putting it in the cup, then maybe this is not the method for you. However method you choose, remember, you have to start tomatoes if you're in a cold place, not a tropical place, of course. You have to start them indoors, and you have to start them around 6 to 8 weeks before the last frost usually, and that way you'll ensure a good tomato crop. If you will start them indoors, you must supply adequate light for them to be successful. No, putting them next to a windowsill will 9 out of 10 times result in failure, unless you have direct sun hitting your seedlings at least 4 to 6 hours a day. I prefer to put mine next to a sunny window with cheap fluorescent or LED lights over them, as I've shown previously. In about 4 weeks, my seedlings usually outgrow their setup, which coincides with when I can start taking them outside. That is, when the weather cooperates and stays in schedule. Cold spells in March can really mess my garden plans. They cause me to delay planting cold-intolerant plants like tomatoes, while grounding them in their restrictive small pots, weeks at a time until the weather improves. Thankfully, unlike cucumbers, tomatoes are very forgiving. Whenever you start your seedlings indoors, the last thing you want to do is to actually plant them directly outside without making them used to the conditions outside first. We call this hardening off. And the problem is that these seedlings have not known strong light, sunlight, it has not known wind and rain and other elements, or even cold. So if you let it get used to the temperatures, to the wind, to the sunlight gradually, by first taking them outside for a couple of hours, and then leaving them the whole day, and then eventually leaving them day and night before planting into the ground. They're going to get used to the conditions, and once you plant them, they're going to experience less shock and just produce quicker. As a rule of thumb, if you're wearing a light jacket and still feel cold, it is too cold for your tomatoes. Much like humans, they really enjoy temperatures around 70 degrees. I had to wait at least 2 weeks longer than expected because of a cold April, and the seedlings were suffering because of that. They desperately wanted to be transplanted into real soil. tomatoes have really taken a beating here. It's because of the weather. It's been dry, wet, cold, hot, even snow. So I cannot plant them in the ground yet. I have to wait a little bit until I have assurance that there's not gonna be any frost anymore. So what I'm gonna do is actually plant a few of them inside of the cold frame. That way I'll test out if this method of jump starting them in a cold frame helps or it doesn't. Coming up in the next block, I will test out planting tomatoes in my cold frame. Will I have better luck this time? Right after this commercial. If you enjoy the videos and would like to support the channel, you can purchase an original painting or drawing in my Etsy shop, or become a patron in my Patreon. I have also started to work on a children's storybook and plan to release it soon in my Etsy shop, so stay tuned for further developments. Whenever you want to jumpstart the growth of a heat-loving plant, putting them under glass will give them the temperature boost they need to zoom up faster. A cold frame works much like a small greenhouse, trapping solar heat, raising both the air and soil temperatures inside. I've heard they will create a microclimate inside the frame that can be compared to moving your garden 2 hardiness zones warmer. That means that my Baltimore raised tomatoes will feel like they are in Georgia. By using cold frames, you can expedite garden production in early spring and extend the season in fall. At least that's the theory, but I've been experimenting with them to see if it works in practice. These tomatoes here are far from being a good specimen. They're leggy and they just look like failures. But I'll just plant them the way we're usually told to plant tomatoes that are a little bit too leggy. You have to bury them on their sides. That way they create roots along the stem and they're able to root well and probably become a winter tomato. That happens because, unlike many other plants, tomatoes can develop roots from their stems. Whenever a stem comes into direct contact with soil, these roots will naturally appear. Many other plants will rot away if their stems are buried in soil. Tomatoes are naturally vining plants that sprawl around and climb over other plants to increase their range. This unruly behavior and adaptability can be used to your advantage when you let them grow too leggy as seedlings. Other plants will develop thin, breakable, and spindly forms if not given the right conditions as young seedlings. Tomatoes are forgiving, and it is because of this that I recommend them as starter plants for first-time gardeners, at least in the Americas. I have heard that growing tomatoes successfully out in the open is almost an agricultural feat in England, due to the higher latitude with the damp and overcast climate that breeds blight and other diseases. My friend Hugh from Hugh's Nursery channel plants his in a polytunnel to give them the extra heat they need there to thrive. Hugh has just released an amazing book, Veg in One Bed, that seems especially great for those first venturing with growing vegetables. He's a great guy, and something tells me that he will be the next Monty Don, just saying. With the test tomatoes safely under glass, I just had to wait a bit longer to grow the other ones out in the open. A couple of weeks later, the situation was not getting much better, with the hot and cold weather swings. May is usually safe for tomato planting, but things have just not been safe weather-wise nowadays. I've grown tired of waiting for the weather to sow my tomatoes, so I'm just gonna do it. They're looking very distressed, and I feel like it's best to get them in the ground because the roots are so root bound than to wait for a potential frost that might or may not happen. So I'm gonna clear this spot here. And this is kind of a special spot because this is where I've been throwing all my weeds for the past years, and I've accumulated it over here. So I'm thinking the soil is gonna be slightly different in texture, and I'll see right now. And as you can see here, the population of weeds has skyrocketed around here. There was rock under here, there's a piece of concrete, and now there's soil, and that's all from the weeds that decomposed. So it'll be an interesting experiment to see what happens here. While I like to continuously push the boundaries when gardening, it is still important to acknowledge some guiding principles for success. Tomatoes need the most sun exposure you can throw at them, so I always devote the sunniest spot for the garden's prima donna plant. It wants it not too cold, not too hot, not too wet, not too dry. It's the Goldilocks plant that wants everything just right. Will my tomatoes get what they want? Will it be a tomato triumph or a sullen sorrow? You will find out as my tomato journey continues in part 2, released next Sunday afternoon. See you there.